Hello. Welcome back to the 21st episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York and my podcast is about culture wars, disinformation and misinformation stories. It's about the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with dramatic and emotive subjects instead of the real issues. It's about small things blown up to upset and distract people. Made-up causes and astroturf organisations, meaning grassroots, in quotes, organisations, actually invented by PRs and lobbyists and named after the American fake grass brand. I'll be talking to the players and the commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening and not happening, because it's made up. And then, if we can, we'll ask some vital questions, a bit of lifestyle, a bit of shopping, a bit of this and that. Now, Professor Bobby Duffy is Director of the Policy Institute and Professor of Public Policy at King's College London. Before that, he was Managing Director of Ipsos Mori's Social Research Institute, a large, important, worldwide commercial research business with a huge archive of large-scale studies. In addition, he's garlanded with committee and board memberships of all sorts of social science institutes and charities, and he's constantly on platforms where he does a very persuasive job of explaining why social science, in the sense of studying society as a basis for social policy, is good for us. And he's written two completely fascinating books. The first, called Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything, A Theory of Human Understanding, shows, on the basis of large sample research across the Western world and wider, how delusional we are about the most basic things, including the number of teenage pregnancies, the number of immigrants of various kinds in our countries, and the realities of wealth and ownership. This is the stuff of politics and policies. How can we ever get it right if we're so ignorant? His second book, Does When You're Born Shape Who You Are, challenges all the myths and stereotypes about generational trends and generational divides. This is all the stuff of culture wars too, and the stuff of social polarisation, what people believe about each other. It's worth saying here that in his ranking of nations by their understanding of themselves and the world, the Italians emerge from Professor Duffy's studies as the most delusional, followed by the United States. Bobby Duffy, what are the consequences of Italian delusions and, so one would think far more important, of American delusions? How do these delusions show up in what they actually say and do?
Great to be here, Peter, and that's a good place to start, because I think, to be honest, where I'd start with it is where do they come from rather than their consequences, because I think it's very important for the culture wars generally to understand that our expression of our understanding of social realities is as much driven by our emotions and identity as a kind of careful analysis of the facts. People don't do that. They don't spend their time researching immigrant numbers or obesity levels or any teenage pregnancies or any of those sorts of themes. And what we see for the Italians, where they stand out, is on indices of emotional expressiveness. There's a book by Aaron Meyer, The Culture Map, which looks at different dimensions across different countries, more from a business perspective about the cultures that you'll experience in different countries. And the Italians come top on those types of measures of emotional expressiveness. So it's sort of akin to exaggerating and big hand movements and your view of
opera,
yes, just big bombast type things, and that's what they express in those. And similarly, Americans, big broad strokes pictures of the world and their own lives, not shrinking. So in some ways, the causes are as interesting as the consequences. The consequences are about, for me, and the worry, and this is where your work is really helpful too, is does end up in this very skewed view of reality linked to an identity. And that's the key point, is if this was randomly distributed, that people had the wrong view of the world, you wouldn't particularly mind. But it is the case that, say, in the UK context, it's reform supporters who have a exaggerated view of the level of immigration. And one of the key concepts in this misperceptions work is the idea of emotional innumeracy, which is that it's not just that our exaggeration causes overestimate of things, it's also is a reflection of our level of worry about an issue. So cause and effect run in both directions, where if you're very worried about immigration for whatever reason, it literally, as an issue, inflates in your brain, and gives you a stronger sense that this is bigger than it actually is. So it leads to one of the key conclusions of all of this work, is that correcting misperceptions through just the use of facts and telling people that they're wrong will only ever have a limited effect, because it partly misdiagnoses the cause, that this is more emotional than a study of the facts. And that's why we see corrections to misperceptions only working in some circumstances and not really changing the other underlying mindsets that people have. So that's the consequences, really. The consequence is this is more emotional. It means that engaging people purely through rational facts and argument misses at least a big part of the point, and this is about emotions and identity.
And as a result, as you show, when you face people with the truth, the fact-checked, the verified stuff, they defend their opinions in a variety of ways, which go from "I don't believe you"
Exactly.
To defending it in terms of their personal observation, what it's like in their town, and things like that. Particularly thinking about Americans, because, as you say, there are these bravura operatic characteristics in Italian culture. Well, not all Americans are Italians. Some are. What are the particular American factors that lead them to adopt nutty ideas about the world?
Yeah, I think we do have a role. There is a role in this for our information environment. And so I draw that really broadly when I think about it, because it is social media platforms, it is what we see online generally, it is more traditional media, and it is our politics, because it's really hard these days to separate those and think of them as different systems, because one feeds off the other. And the US does have a very partisan, polarized information environment more generally. And I do think that element is really important in explaining why we've got a faultier view of reality than we did in the past. Because actually, when I look at the long-term trends, we've never been very good at knowing these realities as humans. You go back to the earliest kind of studies in the 50s and 60s were in the US, and people back then were just as wrong about the things that people asked in these misperception surveys as they are today. I think what's changed is more about how that reinforces an identity. You're on one side or the other, which is one of the key definitional points of culture wars. So I think what the US has quite different from lots of other countries is this very split down the middle two-party system and structure, where you're either a Democrat or Republican, and there is really good work to show that has changed. So you call it the moving mountains chart that Pew produced, where if you go back to the 1990s and you looked at social attitudes of Democrats and Republicans, the mountains were more or less overlapping. There wasn't much difference between the two. But you get to the 2010s and those mountains have pulled apart, so that there's very little overlap now in the attitudes between Republicans and Democrats. And what that means that you can predict more and more of social attitudes in the US just by knowing your party identity, because more and more issues have been rolled into that party identity in something the academics call conflict extension. So you start with one or two issues and then you build on that, and it becomes more and more all-consuming and all-defining for those individuals. And that is the worry. That's the US particular structure that we don't have, say, in the UK, of these two massive blocks facing off against each other and not only having a different view of reality from one another, but also not liking one another or having much more suspicion of one another. So I think that there is a particular difference about the US. And lots of the sociologists and social scientists and political scientists that work in this talk about the US as a deviant case. It's not representative of the world, and it's not predictive of our future because it's got such a strange structure and history and culture in many ways. But having said that, you do worry in the UK context and in other European countries about we are taking on some elements of that US deviant case characteristics.
Now, assuming that we think, and I think I'm hearing this from you, that it's not great for anyone anywhere that the world's most powerful nation should be quite so delusional and apparently increasingly delusional, what can be done about it?
It is really tough. The delusion for me, to be honest, Peter, is an interim symptom rather than the underlying problem or risk. And it's when the delusions align with an identity that we get into trouble. Like I say, if it was randomly distributed, you wouldn't worry so much. But if you've got two political blocs that are facing off to each other and each have their own reality, which are entirely different from each other, then I think you have got a real problem. And we see that, over and over again. So one of the stats is you ask people in the US, what kills more people in the US from guns, knives, or other violence in terms of interpersonal violent deaths? What's the biggest killer? And you'll know this, Peter, yourself. But, when I ask in conferences and audiences, people in the UK mostly guess guns. Some people think you're trying to trick them and it isn't guns, but it's very, very clearly guns. 80% of the deaths, and second only to Mexico in terms of proportion of effectively murders by guns. But when you look at the pattern across the US, it's 83% of strong Democrats know it's guns, think it's guns, but only 27% of strong Republicans think it's guns. So exactly the same reality seen completely differently based on your own identity.
Now, are we teetering around the underlying fact that the madder, most delusional people now in America are MAGA Republicans? That MAGA Republicans, as a sort of consolidated, 30% of the electorate, MAGA Republicans didn't exist in formal terms. I mean, no doubt the seeds of them were very well sown, but they didn't exist before 2016 as a formal group. The MAGA Republicans, or to put it more clearly, Trump, has taken over the whole party, absolutely taken over the whole party. There were old-style Republicans, and I'm not defending them for any particular reasons, but of the Bush variety, who could talk intelligibly to Democrats, and no doubt knew quite a lot of Democrats in their own milieu, and compromises could be effected, and so on and so forth. There is now a complete change on every level, and that complete change is all about the Republicans. The Democrats, to their disadvantage, haven't changed very much. If you think about Kamala Harris and the election that she fought, they haven't registered. They haven't been taken over by a new faction. Maybe they need to be, but they haven't. And it is very clear on any sort of conspiracy theory level that MAGAs believe them all, so it seems. It was certainly, MAGA was the constituency for QAnon and all that stuff, which has most Brits, wherever they are on the spectrum, with their jaws on the floor. The idea that you could conceive anything so extraordinary as the idea that the president or PM could be saving the nation from a deep state conspiracy for access for high-standing paedophiles. And this is putting entirely to one side the Epstein thing. That was the real thing, but that was not what that was based on. How did that happen, that you got this collection of extraordinariness as 30% of the electorate and the total face of the new Republican Party? What is it in America that allowed that to happen?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in that, Peter. And I think there's lots of discussions in the US among the academics about the mechanisms by which they've ended up in quite that divisive position and with that particular profile of Republican positions and supporters. And the arguments are about bottom down or top up. And this is not a thing that has just started. This culture wars are a process and a long process. And you go back to Newt Gingrich and everyone else in between that really sent that divisive, no compromise across party lines type messaging and actions from the very top. And then you kind of go step by step till you end up in this sort of logic. So I think you have seen that play out very much in the Republican Party. The interesting thing is when you look at the population attitudinal change, it's actually on the Republican side as a whole, not just the MAGA side. It's actually the Democrats that have moved, not Republicans, in terms of it. So they've become much more liberal, well, not much more liberal, not like the UK. The US has not moved nearly as much as the UK in terms towards a more liberal, progressive view of social issues. But the Democrats have moved away from the Republicans. Republicans have stayed more or less where they are. So they've kind of been frozen in their social attitudes for quite some time. So there is an element of bottom up about this sort of strange history and culture of the US of so much higher religiosity than the UK and lots of Europe, and that being a key element, a key motivator for lots of people in the US in the way that we don't quite pick up on or often understand. Obviously, all of the history of racial tensions in the US, again, are not played out in nearly the same way here, that all provide this rich mix where you've ended up with this context in which someone working from the top will find it much easier to divide people by pushing those types of narratives and buttons. And that's definitely been an element of this, that the top-down has interacted with the bottom-up conditions of resentment and long cultural tension to really play on those. And that's why we won't follow the US directly down the same sort of culture war path. That history, structure, culture, so different. But we are doing our best to take on elements of it in the UK in our own way. So, yeah, I'm always a bit conflicted when you're talking about these types of things, because people either think the US predicts our future entirely, or they think it's entirely irrelevant to us and we're very different. And the reality is it's a bit of both. And we are stumbling into some of the same mistakes in a much more polarised and divided political structure that people are actively encouraging, and our information environment is increasingly encouraging and importing from the US, directly from the US.
At the moment, the party stroke person leading the polls in the UK is somebody very close to Trump's Washington. Very much part of what somebody described, Matt D'Ancona described as Bannon's Britain. And there it is. The relationship with right-wing America is very clearly there. The relationship, it seems, with Russia is somewhere there. The structure of a populist party run by very rich people also seems to be there. So we do seem to have taken on a fair bit of what America is doing. We do take on Americanisms of all kinds for definable reasons, and have done for a long time. We take them on faster than other Europeans do. It seems rather grim, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a kind of like you'll have this as well. get a lot of requests from European journalists to talk about culture wars and what's coming towards them, because we are quite mid-Atlantic in lots of our...
Yes.
So they see this wave rolling towards them, and we're slightly canary-like as an indicator of what's coming next. And I think there is some truth in that, in our cultural connection to the US and in underlying values, and are a mix of that European and more US. So we got more belief in meritocracy than people on the continent, but not as much as people in America. But in many ways, we're closer to America on some of those types of attitudes. And then, yes, obviously, language and culture make that connection feel more natural to us. So yes, no, I think it is that closeness in values, underlying cultural, as well as the ease with which social media environment and media and political environment can directly import some of those ideas and content directly into the UK. So, I mean, it is incredible that we've got the social media platforms where it's incredible for me to think that in the lifetime we would go back to having open racism on social media platforms that are not just tolerated but amplified. And that is an impact that has stemmed from the US, because that's where that tech comes from and where that cultural approach comes from. So yes, absolutely. We do these culture war studies. And 3 weeks ago we released the latest one, and it shows a really large increase in people's sense of tension in the country between different groups, a real huge increase in people's sense that things are going downhill here and change is happening too fast, and a real, again, similarly huge increase in thinking that things were better in the past, which is a classic populist make America great again framing. And that has only shifted since our last study in 2023. Before that, it was pretty steady. So it looked like the divisive rhetoric wasn't really working so well in the UK. But in the last couple of years, it has really shifted. And it is hard. We need to do much more work on this, but it is hard to not relate that in some way to the shifts in our information environment in that same sort of period, is linked to a changing political structure. But those things are intertwined, and it feels like something has shifted in the last 18 months, 2 years, and that does point to some norms being broken in our information environment that are going to be really hard to put back together again.
Yep. Why are generational delusions so important to you? I mean, obviously the popular idea really funded, really subscribed to very much in the 60s, that youth is rebellious and left-wing, and the older you are, the more conservative. And then you became aware that some generational cohorts were very distinctive and some weren't, including your own. That people born after 1966 are so dull that nobody takes any notice. You said this somewhere. People born after 1966, Generation X, in the wonderful coinage of Douglas Copeland, are so dull that nobody takes any notice of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Why is that?
Yeah, it's my generation. Yeah, we're so dull that no one can even be bothered to hate us, is the element, because it is generations. The reason I'm interested in it is because of that hate type of point. Is generations have been set up and used to encourage a sense of conflict between different age groups and cohorts, and most of it is nonsense. And you just need to take on those myths. But the reason it's important is it does give that sense of higher levels of conflict between old and young than there really is. And what a real problem is, I mean, one of the main themes of the book is a real problem between the generations is not conflict, it's separation. We are living much more separately by generations than we have at any time in human history in terms of where we live. We have sorted younger people into cities, older people outside them, in a way that we think is natural, but actually didn't exist at all up until 1991. Sorry, post-91, that's when we started to divide. On top of that, we've got digital life that's much more important to us now, And despite the vague feeling that older people are more online, there's still the biggest gaps I see between generations are in their technology use on different platforms, doing different things, different intensities. And we've lost lots of community structures, connection to religion, trade union, active trade unionism. That's more about community groups generally. So we've lost so many places where generations came together that we've got this massive gap. And we know when there's lack of contact, that's what leads to stereotyping, when you just don't have much to do with another group. And that stereotyping gives this space for people to create all these conflicts, fake conflicts between young and old. And I think that is really important, because it does turn us into, very suspicious of young people, when really Gen Z are not that weird, not that different at all from previous generations of young. And it is a constant of history that we always think this latest generation of young is the worst ever. They're uniquely wrong and weird. But that's exactly how societies work. Is Auguste Comte, French philosopher, thought that generational change was the key determinant of societal change, because you do get stuck in your ways and you need younger generations coming through to...
And then you need to die.
And you need to die. Yeah, that's right. But that's one of the great tragedies of all the bad generational analysis, is that understanding generations is about understanding the future, because older generations are going to die. So you need to really know what the younger generations are, what's really different about them, not all the cliches and myths, if you want to understand what comes next. And we really messed that up, because we just love the fake headlines about millennials killing stuff and Gen Z being feckless and lazy and entitled. And like you say, Gen X never makes it into any of those headlines, because no one cares about us. We're the forgotten middle child in the generational lineup right now.
There's a new meme running wild amongst the Spectator and Unheard set, which is Nick 30. And Nick 30 is the person so unsatisfied with the UK that he's going to live in Australia or Dubai or somewhere like that.
Yeah.
Now, at the end of your first book, you said that despite all those gloomy, polarising delusions, things were actually getting better on a whole range of determinably important measures, and the Western world, despite itself, is becoming more informed, tolerant, etc., etc. Now, that was 2018. Would you say that today?
You know what? I wouldn't anymore. I don't think. I am more worried than I have been. And that's only in the last couple of years, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm starting on the next book, which is about global values change now. And it's absolutely the case that objective factors are getting better. Still, there are lots of objective factors that are getting better, but there are a lot of objective factors that have stopped getting better. The big ones of life expectancy increases have stalled. Clearly, there's loads of economic indicators that have gone in negative directions for people. But then the big kind of, what does the future hold? So many indicators of people hunkering down, isolationism, conflict across countries, that this next phase feels very pessimistic in my view. It's just very difficult to see where does that sense of a brighter future come from. We used to ask people, well, we still do ask people, do you think today's kids will have a better life than their parents? And up until 2003, half of people said better, a quarter said worse, and then post-financial crash, it was a quarter saying better and half saying worse. It reversed, and it's now down at like 20% of people thinking better and over half thinking it's going to be worse. And that, we've had we're going to be coming up on 2 decades of people thinking the future's going to be worse for their kids. And as a new trend, this is not a natural state for people to be in until that kind of point. You do worry. It's increasingly looking like the post-war period of that sense of generation-on-generation progress was the unusual one. Yeah, so much more pessimistic, actually. And I I'll hopefully get some more optimistic indicators as I work through this book, but they are much harder to find now.
I mean, I say that because a number of very respectable institutions, like the Economist Democracy Index, seem to say everything is getting worse all over. There's less democracy and more authoritarianism. And they define America as a flawed democracy. And I was trying to extract from the Economist editor what she thought they would say about America early next year, with the next report, and she was polite and careful. But I got the strong feeling that flawed would be replaced by some new coinage, like super flawed. I mean, we're looking at a situation where hugely influential figures like Peter Thiel, tech billionaire, funder and supporter of J.D. Vance, has said pretty clearly that he thinks we should give up on democracy in the sense of voting because there were better ways to do it. That is somebody who has fingers in many pies across the world, including here, in terms of supporting various movements, people and things here, which we should take notice of. Now, you've told us about delusions and misapprehensions, and it's marvellous stuff, and the social and the cultural, psychological factors behind them. And I'm sure the new generation of fact-checkers, the BBC Verify, Fact Check Politics, Full Fact, owe a lot to you. But I think you've said the availability of fuller facts, does it do anything more than make the difference between individuals and nations more marked? So sensible Scandinavians, sensible, well-educated Scandinavians will be even more different than today's loopy Italians. And here's the crucial, difficult factor. And better educated people even more distance from less informed groups. In other words, the class factor. The class information education factor. They're not complete overlaps, but they're very related, aren't they?
Yeah, really interesting point. There's a kind of pattern where the more educated, which tends to be related education levels to more left-leaning political supporters, tend to be more correct on these realities. The interesting counterpoint is that they also tend to be much less likely to say they can be friends with the other side than the other way round.
Yep.
So you've got this kind of division of one side seeing reality more clearly and the other side, but that same side not liking the other side. And so in polarization terms, you've got a kind of cognitive element to it, but you've also got an affective element to polarization, which is, how you feel about the other side. So you've not only got distances in terms of how you see the realities, you've got distances in terms of whether you want to or don't want to interact with the other side. And this is where the liberal side is quite guilty of not wanting to see the other side because they just don't like them, or they think less of them, or they never kiss a Tory type theme, but on steroids is a concern about that. So yeah, those types of divisions are different ways of seeing the world, are not just about the realities, it's about how you see the other people. And there is worries in both directions, I think, on that. I mean, I have to say, I kind of like the next book is about some of those things about how it's going to play out around the world. And the thing that I'm really grappling with right now is the extent to which the Samuel Huntington civilizational thinking that has informed at least elements of that Trump cadre of people who are doing the thinking around how do we make this work, effectively what is our theory, about the importance of civilization in shaping deep civilizational trends from history, shaping a national character or a cultural character that is just unchanging, versus the kind of modernization theory people of, well, Marx, but more recently the kind of Engelhardt view of we will become more like each other or more progressive over time as each generation grows up with security in their material lives, so they can move towards more self-expression values. So we'll all that China will become more like us in terms of its values and desire for democracy and all of those types of things. And it's really hard not to conclude that there's a lot of truth in the civilizational view, because when we look at what's changing in people's values and attitudes across a long period, we're definitely not converging across different countries. In fact, we are moving apart. And it's partly because those Western countries are becoming more progressive much quicker, and the other ones are not moving. And so we do have the most divided world, or biggest distance between countries across the world and cultures across the world that we've ever measured, because we just got this splaying apart. How we deal with that, and this is the crucial point, is if China's and other Southeast Asian countries continue to succeed more than Western countries, which is not a high bar right now, then people will increasingly connect those Southeast Asian values to success as opposed to Western values. So this is why this focus on culture and values is so important, not just in national culture wars, but in global cultural tension and power in the end.
And at a time when, leave aside the giants, America and China, the fact is that the rest of the G7 aren't doing so tremendously well. And somebody made the point, was it you, that at a time when China is constantly doubling, reinforcing, building up practically everything in the technical universe, at a time when America has spawned that whole world of Silicon Valley, the biggest stocks in Europe have been things like LVMH. It is a very good way of focusing it, that there is a danger of Europe becoming an expensive holiday destination, being rather extreme. So precisely the time that those other divides are becoming so acute. So is progressive politics an indulgence of a declining or a decadent society? Lots of people might say that.
Yeah, that is part of the kind of cyclical theories of civilizations, isn't it? That you do get to that decadent point and it collapses in on itself, either collapses in on itself or it is overrun by stronger civilizations coming in. And that is the cyclical view of civilizations. Rather than an end of history, we will be going round again on things. And I think that is the big question of our next 30 years, much more so in many ways than national level culture wars or cultural disagreements. It is going to be, how does the whole civilizational picture across the world shift? You can definitely see that happening. You just look at how strategic China has been in not capturing, but definitely leading in key technologies. And this is very much the beginning of that. It's taken us a long time to notice. But once that's started, it does have a logic to it that will play out. It's very difficult to stop that momentum when it gets going, as we kind of, not unlike our history of how did we end up with Western domination, it becomes juggernaut-like.
The whole question of Western, and there I am including American, identity politics, the idea that the Democrats and the Labour Party have been overtaken by overeducated, middle-class, untypical people, very much unlike, so the story goes, very much unlike the original Labour Party base. And these are the people who nurture identity politics of a grievance kind, of a marginal and grievance kind, and are sensitive to cancel culture and what people call wokeism. I would like to know the extent, this is stuff of myth and legend, the extent of that change, and particularly the identity politics part of it, the grievance marginal part of it, and to what extent it was really true of those groups. It's pretty clear about the class basis change, because the way class is constructed in Western countries has utterly changed, because the basis of employment has changed. I can remember, a bit of revelation here, I am by background a market researcher. And as I'm by background a market researcher, I can remember the shaping and writing of traditional questionnaires for traditional survey research. And there was a wonderful little acronym in classification called TAE, Terminal Age of Education. And that's become so much more important. And there's also that rather more recent phrase that people who are in the social survey, political advisor, etc., part of the world, talking amongst themselves, because they don't use it in public, because it's not considered very nice. Low information voters, low information consumers. As a result of that, there's the whole question of who those people are working for and intent in culture wars. I've been contending for some time that culture wars aren't just naturally arising clashes of cultures and values. Kulturkampf, I think, between the emerging Prussian state and the Catholic Church. It's not like that at all. I would say that they are the creations, in large part, of very clever mercenaries, very clever, very highly paid mercenaries who understand the utterly changed world of media and information and know how to create hugely distracting disinformation about the world, which affects people's understandings, affects their relationships, their actions, and votes. In other words, the idea that you start with, for example, I'm not accusing him of everything on earth, somebody like Sir Paul Marshall, and then you follow a chain through PRs and lobbyists and political advisors that then gets into the entrails of what people call advocacy think tanks, which are the direct descendants of the Anthony Fisher movement. And then thence it gets passed on to client media and friendly politicians. Then that way you can have third-party evidence which appears to come from over there, which newspapers can seize on, which say, all my ideas are confirmed by the fellows and special investigators of this wonderfully neutral thing called a think tank, which just happens to be in SW1. Is that fair?
I think it's certainly true. Whether it's the full picture is like one of the key traps and challenges of this area, because it's kind of what people can hear when you talk about this is down to a shadowy structure and activities, is that you're denying that there are any cultural tensions bubbling from the bottom up, if you like. There isn't an element of, yes, but they're reflecting a real concern that people have that UK culture is changing too fast, or they don't agree with this level of immigration, or they have got issues about gender identity, etc. And it's kind of, that is unfortunately how people react to that, can react to that. And I think that we have to hold both things as true in our minds, that there is a legitimate, in some way, in many ways, sense of resentment and concern from people who have had no progress in their lives and think of the world as a zero-sum game where your protection of particular characteristics is taking from them in particular ways. But definitely there are people who are engineering that sense of division and exaggerating it and then creating it. And it's a really interesting one, this, because the kind of blue Labour dilemma of the extent to which trying to show that you understand that also normalises that and can end up reinforcing that sense of resentment and zero-sum game. And it's the big thing in my mind, because we're starting a big study across Europe on attitudes to immigration going back decades, in a very fancy analysis that other people are doing to try to stitch together a view, not just for academic purposes, but try to link it to what was the tone of political policy debate and media debate around immigration when people were growing up. Because the early indications and hypothesis is that formative years are very important to setting your views on these kind of cultural things, and you take some of that with you, that people growing up in those formative years, or going through those formative years in an era of very negative discussions about immigration, for example, and very restrictive policy, are likely to stay more negative about immigration throughout their life. And I think that's the thing. This is the big dilemma, is where does recognising and showing legitimate concern for people, the public's own legitimate concerns, turn into actually shaping a norm that we're going to be living with for decades, and rolling back a sense of a more open sense that will be really difficult to re-establish. I don't have an answer to that, but I do think it's like that is the crucial element, and the people taking those decisions need to recognise that they're not just reflecting or trying to reflect and show that they understand people's concerns, they're also shaping those concerns, and not just for this electoral cycle, but potentially for decades.
Before the pandemic altered your view of the sequence of history in a rather odd way. But it was just before the pandemic I found myself quizzing the people who did the crash study at Cambridge of people's, and across Europe, of people's understanding of conspiracy theories. And of course, the crucial conspiracy theory was the Great Replacement, which operated in slightly different ways in all those nations. The idea that there is a conscious plan with conscious planners to replace the existing populations with immigrants of various kinds, and to replace the culture and laws with different ones. So, in the case of this country, replace them with Sharia law. Now, that didn't happen by accident. A Frenchman wrote a book. It got everywhere. It was the lead factor in the way that Donald Trump introduced himself to the world as a politician, going down that escalator in the Trump Tower. And as you say, the massive overestimation of immigrants, a percentage of the population of practically anywhere in the West. But who was worst? You had a table of who was absolutely overestimated immigrants. Anyway, It was very dramatic.
Yeah.
So if you can have, in effect, a sort of cultural factory, an international cultural factory, which takes ideas like that French gent's idea and plays it out to people who are ready to receive it, that does say, doesn't it, that intent, mercenaries and money are really very, very important in these things, and that without them, there'd be less tension.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do think that's right. I think I probably have shifted a bit in my view of these types of things, because, the kind of last example would be around Brexit.
Yeah.
And the extent to which people were concerned that was a big psyop approach on astroturfing, like you say, and all of that. And I think that most of the work kind of suggests it wasn't nearly as impactful as then some people made out on views. But I think we have an utterly different environment now And I do think these things really matter. There is another strand of my work, including a current study we're working on, which is specifically on conspiracism, including Great Replacement Theory and all. And it is, big chunks, big minorities. It's still a minority of the population, but big minorities of the population who do believe in those types of things. In the UK, this is. So the best evidence that we can get from academic work on conspiracy belief is, again, that it hasn't particularly increased over the long term, over the decades. We haven't had a sense of big shifts, that there's more people. But it's not dissimilar to the misperceptions point, that it's less about whether this is massively growing to encompass the whole population than how much more it becomes tied up in people's identity, particularly political identity. Yeah. That's what I worry about. We'd obviously be worried if 70 or 80% people believed in lizard people running the world, or that's not where we are. These are minority beliefs, but they are increasingly tied to a sense of political identity, and that is a worry. Where some of that identity is, rip it all up, not just MAGA republicanism or anything else, and that's a
very strong anarchist streak in all that, and the group may not be growing. It's a consistent, but as you say, its identity and therefore its political potential. What I don't know, I wish I did. I wish I were a better historian. I don't know the exact between wars comparisons, but it's important to know. And there wasn't nearly as much polling then, but there was some, wasn't there?
Yeah. Yes, there was.
To look at those comparisons and look at how, petty bourgeois Germans became convinced that Jews were responsible for all their problems and things like that. That would be very interesting to see what's happened. But in the meanwhile, I'm acutely conscious of what Jason Stanley and Timothy Snyder did and said recently, moving to somewhere in Toronto from Yale, and saying, both of them, that according to the studies they'd both made from different perspectives, philosophy prof, history prof, of the precedents between the wars, America had crossed the line into fascism. They said that very clearly. It's been very little reported in this country, but very widely reported in the legacy mainstream press and broadcasters in America. I don't know why it's not been picked up here.
Yes, it's we have a strange relationship with coverage of the US, as you'll know better than me, Peter. It often misses the big picture to focus on the distractions.
There's a great deal now, particularly in the BBC, there's a great deal of coverage of America, both in news and things like Radio 4 Americas, things like that. And it's very clever, it's very well informed, they've got very good people, but somehow the big picture conclusions and certain individual items which are rather startling and worrying, like Jason Stanley and Timothy Snyder going to the Monk, I think it's called the Monk School, isn't it? I'm sure, but it's a university in Toronto, which you are involved with.
Yeah, I'm a fellow there,
So, look, power to your elbow in this next study, because it's the most important thing in the world now. The people's interaction with the idea of immigration and their own identity, their political identities, their political action is just the most important thing. And it does take priority across the board in here and in Europe. Great question as to whether it should, whether the numbers, the substantive issues justify it, but it does. And so the more light you can cast on it, and you've got an enormous archive, haven't you, amongst other things?
Yes.
And very big samples and very big reach. You know, it's Europe plus.
Yes.
It's the West plus Indonesia, Malaysia, I see in your table. So it's a very big reach indeed.
Yes.
And I can't wait to hear what you've got to tell us. When is it coming out? Everybody should be on the edge of their seats.
So the book will be out in September 27, but it will start to drip feed the analysis out from October 26. So we'll get as much out as we can from October 26.
Well, the world needs it. Thank you very, very much indeed for talking to us.
That was great. Really enjoyed that. Thank you, Peter.
Huge thanks to Professor Bobby Duffy of King's College London. Next week's episode, the last before Christmas, will feature festive excess, cultural commentary and sparkle, all arranged tremendously tastefully, or at least entertainingly. This podcast is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.